He came to honor veterans, but when Jimmy Fallon mocked his past, Chuck Norris took off the mic and took back the room. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. What began as a lighthearted promotional appearance for a new charity initiative took an unexpected turn, revealing a side of late-night television many never see. A confrontation that would leave a seasoned host reeling and an audience questioning the very nature of entertainment. The Tonight Show studio, a familiar beacon of laughter and celebrity charm, buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. The band rehearsed a final riff, lights danced across the iconic blue curtain, and the audience, a vibrant sea of anticipation, settled into their seats. Tonight's guest was a figure whose name alone evoked a sense of enduring strength and quiet integrity. An actor, martial artist, and philanthropist, here to discuss his latest passion project, a foundation dedicated to supporting veterans and their families as they transition back to civilian life. He had arrived with no fanfare, his demeanor calm and unassuming, a stark contrast to the often exaggerated persona that decades of pop culture had woven around him. He was here for a cause close to his heart, expecting a conversation that would illuminate the needs of those who had served, perhaps share an amusing anecdote or two, and then fade back into the relative quiet he preferred when not actively working. Jimmy Fallon, the ever-effervescent host, moved through the backstage labyrinth with his signature blend of boyish enthusiasm and practiced showmanship. He was known for his games, his impressions, his ability to make even the most guarded celebrity crack a smile. His writers, however, had spent the afternoon huddled in their room, crafting a segment they believed would be edgy, something that would break the internet. They had compiled a list of questions designed to playfully prod at the guest's legendary status, to deconstruct the myth, perhaps even to provoke a reaction that would make for a memorable, shareable clip. A junior producer, new to the team, had voiced a slight unease about the tone of some of the proposed questions, wondering if they might cross a line from playful to disrespectful, but her concerns were quickly dismissed by a senior writer who quipped, "He's a legend. He can handle it. Besides, it's all in good fun, right?" The guest, meanwhile, sat quietly in his dressing room, reviewing a few notes about the charity. He wasn't one for elaborate preparations for talk shows. His approach was always to be genuine, to speak from the heart. He appreciated the platform Fallon's show offered, a chance to reach millions with a message of support for men and women who had sacrificed much. He harbored no illusions about the nature of late-night television. It was entertainment, first and foremost, but he trusted in a baseline of professional courtesy. The show's opening monologue hit all the usual marks, eliciting waves of laughter from the studio audience. Fallon was in his element, charismatic and quick-witted. Then came the introduction, warm and effusive, painting the guest as an icon, a hero, a man larger than life. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous, a genuine outpouring of affection and respect. He smiled, waved, and took his seat, the picture of graciousness. The initial segment of the interview unfolded smoothly. Fallon, with practiced ease, guided the conversation from the guest's recent projects to the genesis of the Veterans Foundation. The guest spoke eloquently about the challenges facing returning soldiers, the importance of community support, and the specific programs the foundation was launching. He shared a poignant story about a young veteran he had met, a story that hushed the audience and brought a visible flicker of emotion even to Fallon's eyes. The chemistry seemed good, the banter light, the message clear. For a moment, it seemed like the junior producer's concerns had been unfounded, that the interview would proceed as a respectful, engaging conversation about a worthy cause. The guest felt at ease, opening up about his motivations, his hopes for the foundation. He believed he was in a safe space, a place where the inherent dignity of his mission would be honored. The bright studio lights felt warm, the audience's gaze supportive. He was, after all, on The Tonight Show, a bastion of American entertainment, a place where legends were celebrated, not skewered. The initial questions about his public image, the almost mythical status he held in popular culture, were fielded with a familiar blend of self-deprecating humor and quiet sincerity. He acknowledged the facts and memes that had sprung up around his name over the decades, treating them as a strange but mostly harmless byproduct of a long career in the public eye. He'd always understood that such legends were not about him, the man, but about a character, an idea of indomitable strength that people seemed to find comforting or amusing. He gently steered the conversation back to the veterans, explaining that the real strength he admired was not the kind found in action movies or internet jokes, but in the resilience of those who had faced genuine adversity and were fighting to rebuild their lives. Fallon nodded along, his expression one of rapt attention, but a keen observer might have noticed his fingers idly shuffling his blue note cards, his gaze flicking down to them more frequently. The transition, when it came, was subtle at first, cloaked in the guise of a follow-up question. "You know," Fallon began, leaning forward with an air of friendly curiosity, "you've always represented this image of ultimate toughness, the guy who can't be beaten. But we live in a different world now, don't we? A world that's, shall we say, a bit more sensitive. Do you ever feel like that old-school, tough guy persona is a little out of step?" The guest considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "I think genuine strength," he replied, his voice calm and measured, "isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's about resilience, integrity, standing up for what's right even when it's not popular. Those values aren't old school, they're timeless. And they're certainly what I see in the veterans I'm working to support." It was a deft redirection, bringing the focus back to his charity, but Fallon wasn't to be deterred. He chuckled, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. Right, but come on, you've seen the memes. Tears don't cry, he does." He counted to infinity twice. People love that stuff. But does it ever feel like a caricature? Like you're trapped by this legend? The guest smiled faintly. "It's not something I spend much time thinking about, Jimmy. The legend, as you call it, has a life of its own. It's an exaggeration, a bit of fun. My focus is on the real world, on tangible things like helping a veteran find a job or get access to mental health care. That's where the real work lies, not in worrying about internet jokes." He spoke with a quiet dignity, his gaze steady. He was not dismissive of Fallon's line of questioning, but he was also clearly trying to guide the conversation back to more substantive territory. The audience, for the most part, seemed to appreciate his grounded perspective. A ripple of applause followed his statement. Fallon, however, seemed to interpret this as a challenge. His grip on the note cards tightened. The playful glint in his eyes was replaced by something more calculating. He leaned back, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Okay, fair enough," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely mean it. "But let's talk about something that's a bit more current. You've been in the public eye for a very long time, and over the years you've made statements, taken stances that, looking back, some might see as, well, let's just say they haven't aged perfectly. In today's climate, with social media and a greater awareness of certain issues, do you ever regret some of the things you've said or the roles you've played?" The shift in tone was palpable. The air in the studio, moments before filled with appreciative murmurs, suddenly grew cooler. The guest's posture, which had been relaxed and open, subtly stiffened. He recognized the scent of an ambush, the carefully laid trap disguised as a legitimate inquiry. He had navigated such waters before, but rarely with a host who seemed so intent on steering the ship directly into a storm. His publicist, watching from the wings, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was not the interview they had been promised. This was veering into territory they had explicitly asked to avoid, not because the guest had anything to hide, but because he was here to advocate for others, not to relitigate decades-old sound bites taken out of context. The guest paused, choosing his words with care. "I believe that growth and understanding are lifelong processes. Jimmy," he began, his voice even. "If any of us were judged solely on things we said or did decades ago, without context or the opportunity for evolution, who among us would stand scrutiny? My actions and my work today, particularly with the Foundation, speak to who I am now and what I value." He attempted to steer the conversation once more towards the present, towards the positive impact he was trying to make. But Fallon, like a bloodhound on a scent, seemed determined to dig into the past, to unearth something that could be twisted into controversy. But that's a bit of a dodge, isn't it? Fallon pressed, his smile widening, though it now looked more like a rictus. I'm talking about specific instances. For example, there was an interview in the early 90s where you made some comments about gender roles that would definitely not fly today. And some of your early film roles, while iconic, have been criticized by modern audiences for perpetuating certain stereotypes. Don't you feel a responsibility to address those things, to perhaps apologize or clarify your stance for a new generation? The guest's eyes, which had remained calm, now flickered with a hint of steel. The attempt to paint him as out of touch, as someone whose past needed to be apologized for, was a tactic he had seen used before, usually by those more interested in generating clicks than genuine dialogue. "Jimmy," he said, his voice dropping slightly, a subtle shift that those who knew him recognized as a sign of deep displeasure, "I am always willing to have a respectful conversation about complex issues. However, I'm not here tonight to be put on trial for sound bites from 30 years ago, especially when my purpose for being on your show is to talk about the urgent needs of our nation's veterans." He looked directly at Fallon, his gaze unwavering. These men and women are facing real challenges: homelessness, PTSD, unemployment. That's what I believe deserves our attention. That's what I came here to discuss. The directness of his rebuke seemed to momentarily stun Fallon. The host blinked, his smile faltering for a split second before he quickly pasted it back on. But the damage was done. The pretense of a friendly chat had been shattered, and the interview had taken a decidedly adversarial turn. The audience sensed it too. The laughter had died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence, the kind that settles over a room when a private argument accidentally spills into public view. The bright studio lights suddenly fell harsh, exposing the raw nerve that Fallon had so carelessly, or perhaps intentionally, struck. The guest remained composed, a pillar of dignity in the face of an increasingly hostile interrogation. He had come to uplift, to inspire, to rally support for a noble cause. Instead, he found himself defending his character, his history, his very relevance, against a host who seemed more interested in creating a moment of controversy than in fostering a meaningful exchange. The taste of disappointment was bitter, but his resolve did not waver. He would not allow his message to be entirely derailed, nor would he allow his integrity to be impugned without a firm, clear response. The battle lines had been drawn, not by him, but for him, and he would meet the challenge with the same quiet strength he had brought to every other aspect of his life. Fallon, however, seemed to double down, perhaps misinterpreting the guest's controlled anger as a sign of weakness, or perhaps driven by a producer's voice in his earpiece urging him to press on for the sake of good television. "But don't you think, as a public figure, you have an obligation to be accountable for your entire history?" Fallon persisted, his tone taking on a distinctly prosecutorial edge. "It's not about putting you on trial. It's about transparency. If your views have evolved, isn't this the perfect platform to share that evolution? Or are there some parts of your past you'd rather just keep hidden?" The insinuation was clear, and it was ugly. The guest's jaw tightened visibly. The faint smile he had maintained through the earlier, more playful needling was now entirely gone, replaced by an expression of profound disappointment and burgeoning indignation. "Jimmy," he began, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of unmistakable force, "my life has been an open book for nearly half a century. I have never shied away from discussing my beliefs or my experiences, provided the conversation is conducted with respect and in good faith. What you're doing now," he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the studio, taking in the uncomfortable faces in the audience, the suddenly very busy-looking crew members, "does not feel like a good-faith inquiry. It feels like an attempt to create a gotcha moment, to generate controversy at the expense of a serious discussion about a critical issue." He gestured subtly towards the promotional materials for his Veterans Foundation that were displayed on the small table between them. "This is why I'm here. These are the people whose stories deserve to be told. Their sacrifices, their needs, their resilience. If you're not interested in that, then I have to question the premise of this entire interview. The direct challenge to Fallon's motives hung in the air. The host, for the first time, looked genuinely flustered. His usual rapid-fire delivery faltered. He shuffled his note cards, his eyes darting towards the teleprompter as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. The script his writers had so carefully prepared had not accounted for this level of direct, principled resistance. I am interested, of course, I'm interested in the foundation, Fallon stammered, his voice lacking its usual confident timbre. But as a host, it's also my job to ask the tough questions, the questions our audience might be thinking. Is that what your audience is thinking, Jimmy? The guest countered, his tone sharp but not aggressive. Are they thinking about sound bites from decades ago? Or are they, like me, more concerned about the fact that thousands of veterans sleep on the streets every night in this country? Are they thinking about the suicide rate among former service members? Are they thinking about the families struggling to cope with the aftermath of war? He leaned forward, his passion for the cause evident in every line of his face, in the intensity of his gaze. Because those are the tough questions I came here to address. Those are the issues that demand our attention and our action. And frankly, I'm disappointed that you seem more interested in dissecting my past than in helping me shine a light on their present. The moral high ground had been unequivocally seized. Fallon looked like a man who had wandered into a minefield and just heard the click of a detonator beneath his feet. The audience was now entirely still, the atmosphere thick with a tension that was far removed from the usual light-hearted fare of late night. Several audience members exchanged uneasy glances. One woman in the front row could be seen shaking her head slowly, her expression one of clear disapproval aimed at the host. The power dynamic in the studio had irrevocably shifted. The guest, who had walked in expecting a collegial conversation, had been forced into the role of a reluctant combatant, defending not just his own integrity, but the very purpose of his appearance. Fallon, who had begun the segment with an air of smug superiority, now found himself exposed, his tactics laid bare for all to see. His attempt to appear as a hard-hitting journalist probing uncomfortable truths had backfired spectacularly, revealing instead a host willing to sacrifice decency for a fleeting moment of manufactured drama. The silence stretched, broken only by the almost inaudible hum of the studio lights. The guest held Fallon's gaze, his disappointment palpable. He had not sought this confrontation, but he would not shrink from it either. His commitment to the veterans he served was far too profound to allow it to be overshadowed by a host's misguided attempt at sensationalism. He had given Fallon an opportunity to pivot, to return to the substantive issues, but it seemed the host was either unwilling or unable to change course. The carefully crafted persona of the affable, fun-loving Jimmy Fallon was crumbling under the weight of his own misjudgment, and the man beneath was proving to be far less appealing. The guest waited a moment longer for Fallon to respond, to acknowledge the misstep, perhaps even to apologize and steer the conversation back to its intended course. But Fallon, seemingly trapped by his own ego or the unseen pressures of his producers, chose to dig in further. "Look," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier forced bravado, though it now sounded brittle. "I understand you want to focus on the charity, and that's admirable. But you're a public figure, a very influential one. And with that influence comes a certain level of scrutiny. People want to know that the heroes they admire are consistent in their values, that they're not just saying one thing and doing another." The implication was a thinly veiled accusation of hypocrisy, and it was the spark that ignited the guest's simmering indignation into a controlled but formidable blaze. "Jimmy," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, each word carefully enunciated like a hammer striking an anvil, "I have dedicated a significant portion of my life, my resources, and my reputation to causes I believe in. I have done so quietly, without seeking fanfare, because the work itself is what matters, not the credit one receives for it." He gestured again to the Foundation's materials. "This initiative for veterans is not a whim. It is born from a deep-seated respect for those who have served and a profound understanding of the sacrifices they have made. For you to sit there and imply, however subtly, that my commitment is somehow disingenuous, or that I am using this cause to mask some hidden agenda, is not just offensive to me, Jimmy. It is offensive to every veteran this foundation seeks to help. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Fallon's face, which had been flushed, now began to pale. The confidence he had displayed moments earlier was visibly draining away, replaced by a dawning awareness that he had profoundly misjudged his guest and the situation. The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. They were witnessing a public figure of immense standing deliver a powerful, unrehearsed rebuke, and the target was their usually beloved host. "I'm not questioning your commitment to the charity," Fallon backpedaled, his voice losing its edge, now laced with a note of desperation. "I'm just trying to understand, to explore the complexities of a public figure who also holds strong personal convictions that might, at times, seem at odds with broader societal shifts." Complexities? The guest's eyebrow arched. "There is nothing complex about treating people with respect, Jimmy. There is nothing complex about honoring commitments. There is nothing complex about using a platform like yours to elevate important issues rather than to tear down individuals for sport." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You speak of societal shifts. One of the most important shifts we need is a return to basic decency in public discourse. A willingness to listen rather than just to provoke. A desire to understand rather than merely to judge." His gaze swept over Fallon, then to the audience, then back to the host. "You had an opportunity tonight to facilitate a meaningful conversation about a critical issue affecting millions of Americans. You had a chance to use your considerable influence to genuinely help people. Instead, he shook his head slowly, a look of profound sorrow replacing the anger in his eyes. You chose this. You chose to pursue a fleeting, manufactured controversy. You chose to prioritize a potential viral moment over a real opportunity to do good." The guest's composure was absolute, his dignity a stark contrast to Fallon's visibly crumbling demeanor. He was no longer just defending himself. He was articulating a broader critique of a media culture that often valued sensation over substance. He had come prepared to discuss solutions, to inspire action, but found himself mired in a pointless, disrespectful inquisition. The silence in the studio was now heavy, almost suffocating. The only sound was the faint whirring of the cameras, diligently recording every uncomfortable second of a television segment gone disastrously wrong. Fallon opened his mouth, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. The note cards in his hand trembled slightly. He looked less like a confident talk show host and more like a student who had been called to the principal's office and knew he was in serious trouble. The guest, seeing that Fallon had no substantive response, no apology, no attempt to genuinely pivot, made a decision. He had endured the disrespect. He had stated his case. He had defended his integrity and the integrity of his cause. There was nothing more to be said, nothing more to be gained by remaining in a situation that had become untenable. The shift from a simmering, controlled anger to a quiet, resolute decision was almost imperceptible, yet it filled the studio with an undeniable finality. The guest looked at Jimmy Fallon, not with contempt, but with a profound, almost weary disappointment. It was the look one gives to someone who has squandered a significant opportunity, who has failed a crucial test of character. "You know, Jimmy," he began, his voice now remarkably calm, holding a quiet authority that resonated more powerfully than any shout could have. "I've been a guest on many shows over many decades. I've faced all manner of questions, some insightful, some challenging, some frankly ridiculous. But I have always been treated with a fundamental level of professional respect, an understanding that we are both there to do a job, to engage an audience, hopefully to entertain, and perhaps even to enlighten." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Tonight, that line was crossed. What happened here wasn't an interview. It was an interrogation designed to provoke and to mischaracterize. It was disrespectful not only to me, but to the very important cause I came here to champion. Fallon started to speak, A desperate no, that's not escaping his lips, but the guest raised a hand, a simple, almost gentle gesture that nonetheless silenced him immediately. I came here in good faith, Jimmy, to talk about the sacrifices of our veterans and how we, as a society, can better support them. That conversation, the one that truly matters, has been made impossible by the direction you chose to take. He then turned his gaze slightly, addressing not just Fallon but the wider audience, both in the studio and watching at home. To everyone who tuned in tonight, hoping to hear about the foundation, about the real-life heroes it serves, I sincerely apologize that this is what you witnessed instead. Their stories are important, their needs are urgent, and I promise you, I will find other avenues to share that message. Avenues where the focus can remain on them, where it belongs. The dignity in his voice, the unwavering commitment to his cause, even in the face of personal attack, was striking. The studio audience, which had been largely silent and tense, began to murmur, and then a smattering of applause broke out, quickly growing into a wave of supportive affirmation. It wasn't the usual boisterous, prompted applause of a late-night show. It was a spontaneous expression of respect for the stand the guest was taking. Fallon looked aghast, watching his carefully controlled environment unravel before his eyes, his audience siding not with him, but with the man he had tried to diminish. The guest then began the subtle but unmistakable process of disengaging. He reached for the small lapel microphone, his fingers working at the clip. The sound, though tiny, seemed to echo in the vast, suddenly charged space of the studio. "What were you doing?" Fallon asked, his voice a hoarse whisper, the reality of the situation finally crashing down upon him. "I believe my time here is done, Jimmy," the guest stated simply, his voice devoid of malice but firm with resolve. He successfully unclipped the microphone and placed it carefully on the coffee table between them, next to the now ironic promotional display for his foundation. "I will not participate in a charade that demeans a serious issue and disrespects the very people I am trying to help." He stood then, not abruptly, but with a deliberate grace that commanded the attention of every person in the room. He was a tall man, and his presence, even in a simple suit, seemed to fill the stage. He nodded once, a curt, final acknowledgement to Fallon, then turned towards the audience. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice clear and strong. And then he began to walk off the set. The applause surged again, louder this time, a standing ovation from a significant portion of the audience. Fallon sat frozen at his desk, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. His producers were no doubt screaming in his earpiece, but he seemed incapable of reacting, of trying to salvage the moment, of doing anything but watch as his meticulously planned segment, his show, his reputation, imploded in real time. The guest did not look back. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, disappearing behind the blue curtain from which he had emerged what felt like an eternity ago, but had in reality been less than half an hour. The void he left on stage was immense, filled only by the stunned silence that eventually overcame the applause and the palpable sense that something irrevocable had just occurred. The bright studio lights seemed to glare down on Jimmy Fallon, alone at his desk, the discarded microphone a stark symbol of the interview that had catastrophically imploded. The standing ovation for the departed guest slowly subsided, replaced by an unnerving quiet. Fallon, who thrived on audience laughter and adulation, now faced a sea of faces that were largely unsmiling, many etched with disapproval or disbelief. He looked small, diminished, his usual effervescent charm extinguished. His eyes darted to his note cards, then to the teleprompter, as if searching for a script to navigate this uncharted territory. But there was no pre-written recovery for a disaster of this magnitude. "Well, he began, his voice hoarse, a forced, weak chuckle escaping his lips. "That was unexpected." The attempt at levity fell spectacularly flat. The silence in the studio only deepened. A few audience members began to whisper amongst themselves, their voices carrying in the stillness. From a control booth, the frantic voice of a producer crackled in Fallon's earpiece. "Cut to commercial." Cut to commercial now. Fallon, looking like a drowning man grasping for a life raft, nodded numbly. We'll be right back after this break, he announced, his usually confident delivery replaced by a shaky uncertainty. The screen abruptly cut to a brightly colored car commercial, the jarring shift in tone only highlighting the raw, uncomfortable reality of what had just transpired. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric with panic. The guest, true to his word, had exited the studio building almost immediately, his publicist and security detail clearing a path through the stunned network pages and bewildered crew members. He offered no comment, his expression serene but resolute. His departure was as dignified as his on-air stand. Inside the studio, during the extended commercial break, Fallon was reportedly apoplectic, pacing his dressing room, alternately blaming his writers, his producers, and the guest himself. The senior writer who had dismissed the junior producer's earlier concerns was now ashen-faced, understanding that his quip about good fun had paved the way for a career-altering catastrophe. Network executives were already on the phone, their voices sharp with anger and concern. The phrase PR nightmare was uttered more than once. The immediate fallout was swift. By the time the show returned for its final segments, the hashtag FallonFail and hashtag I stand against my name hashtags were already trending globally on social media. Clips of the confrontation, captured by audience members on their phones despite studio prohibitions, were spreading like wildfire, each view and share amplifying the host's humiliation and the guest's principled stand. Fallon attempted to soldier through the remainder of the show, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. His subsequent interactions with other guests were stilted, his jokes landed with thuds, and the studio audience remained largely subdued, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by a palpable sense of discomfort. The air had been sucked out of the room, and no amount of forced laughter or pre-recorded applause could disguise it. The following morning, the incident dominated entertainment news. Major news outlets dissected the confrontation frame by frame. Media critics penned scathing reviews of Fallon's conduct, labeling it unprofessional, disrespectful, and a stunning abuse of his platform. Many contrasted his aggressive, accusatory style with the guest's unwavering dignity and articulate defense of his principles and his charity. The guest, through his spokesperson, issued a brief, measured statement. My purpose in appearing on The Tonight Show was to raise awareness and support for our nation's veterans. I am disappointed that the conversation took an unproductive and disrespectful turn. However, I remain committed to the vital work of the Foundation and will continue to advocate for those who have served our country. The statement was a masterclass in restraint, further highlighting Fallon's on-air meltdown. Fallon himself remained silent for a day, reportedly in crisis meetings with his team and network executives. When he finally addressed the controversy on his next show, his apology was widely perceived as insufficient, a carefully worded attempt to mitigate damage rather than a sincere expression of remorse. He spoke of a misunderstanding and a conversation that went off the rails, but he stopped short of taking full responsibility for his aggressive tactics or offering a direct apology for the disrespect shown to his guest. This only fueled further criticism. The Veterans Foundation, ironically, saw a massive surge in public interest and donations in the days following the interview. The guest's principled stand had inadvertently shone a brighter spotlight on the cause than a routine interview ever could have. People were moved by his passionate defense of the veterans and disgusted by the attempt to derail that message. The incident became a case study in media ethics, in the responsibilities that come with a public platform, and in the enduring power of quiet dignity in the face of performative aggression. The reverberations of that fateful night on The Tonight Show continued for weeks, then months. Jimmy Fallon's ratings, once consistently high, took a noticeable dip and struggled to recover. Advertisers grew wary, and whispers about his future at the network began to circulate within industry circles. The carefully cultivated image of the affable, harmless funny man had been irrevocably tarnished, replaced by the perception of a host who would stoop to ambush tactics and personal attacks for the sake of a viral moment. A moment that ultimately backfired. making him the subject of ridicule rather than the orchestrator of a clever takedown. Critics pointed out that Fallon had fundamentally misunderstood his audience and his guest. Viewers tuned into The Tonight Show for escapism, for lighthearted entertainment, for a chance to see their favorite celebrities in a relaxed, friendly setting. They did not tune in for aggressive interrogations or uncomfortable, personal confrontations. And they certainly did not appreciate seeing a respected figure, particularly one advocating for a universally admired cause like veteran support, being subjected to what many deemed a public shaming. The guest, in contrast, emerged from the incident with his reputation not only intact but enhanced. His calm, dignified response to Fallon's provocations, his articulate defense of his principles, and his unwavering focus on his charitable mission resonated deeply with the public. He became a symbol of integrity in an industry often criticized for its superficiality. The memes that Fallon had tried to weaponize were now overshadowed by a new narrative, that of a man of substance who refused to be bullied or belittled, even on one of television's biggest stages. The Veterans Foundation continued to benefit from the increased visibility. The guest quietly redirected the outpouring of support towards their programs, ensuring that the ultimate beneficiaries of the unfortunate incident were the very people he had sought to help. He gave few interviews about the confrontation itself, preferring to let his actions on that night speak for themselves. When asked, he would simply reiterate his disappointment that the focus had been diverted from the veterans' needs, but expressed gratitude for the subsequent public generosity towards the cause. In the long run, the clash served as a stark lesson for the entertainment industry. It highlighted a growing public weariness with gotcha, journalism, and confrontational interview styles, particularly when aimed at individuals known for their positive contributions. It underscored the idea that authenticity and respect are not just desirable qualities, but essential components of public trust. For Jimmy Fallon, the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Some viewers eventually forgave or forgot, but many never looked at him the same way again. The incident became a permanent footnote in his career, a reminder of a night when his ambition overreached his judgment, when his pursuit of a sensational moment led to a spectacular and very public failure. He had sought to control the narrative, to deconstruct a legend, but in the end, he was the one who was deconstructed, his own persona stripped bare to reveal a surprising lack of depth and an unsettling willingness to engage in professional cruelty. The guest, meanwhile, continued his work, both on screen and off, his legacy as a man of quiet strength, an unwavering principle further solidified by a confrontation he never sought but met with undeniable grace. The world had seen, in stark relief, the difference between manufactured fame and earned respect, and the verdict was clear. True character, it turned out, wasn't about delivering the loudest punchline, but about standing firm on the solid ground of one's convictions, even when the bright lights of a television studio threatened to blind and disorient. The silence he left in his wake on that stage spoke volumes, a more powerful statement than any shouted retort could ever have been. The dust eventually settled, as it always does in the relentless 24-hour news cycle of modern media, but the legacy of that on-air clash lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in green rooms and production meetings across the television landscape. The Tonight Show, under Jimmy Fallon, continued, but it operated under a new, more cautious paradigm. The edgy segments became rarer, the questioning of guests noticeably gentler, almost penitent. It was as if a collective lesson had been learned, or at least, a new set of unwritten rules had been established about the limits of acceptable provocation. The guest, true to his nature, never publicly gloated over Fallon's subsequent struggles or the widespread vindication of his own actions. When opportunities arose in other interviews to comment on the incident, he would politely decline or steer the conversation back to his ongoing work with the Veterans Foundation. His silence on the matter was, in itself, a powerful statement, conveying a sense of having moved on, of being above the fray, while Fallon remained, in many ways, defined by that single disastrous segment. The foundation, which had seen an unprecedented spike in donations and public awareness, leveraged this newfound momentum to expand its programs. New centers were opened, more veterans received critical support services, and the guest often spoke of this as the unexpected silver lining to an otherwise regrettable event. He ensured that the narrative, as much as he could control it, became one of triumph for the cause, not personal vindication. In Hollywood, the incident sparked countless conversations about the responsibility of media platforms and the ethics of celebrity interviews. Other public figures, emboldened by the guest stand, became more assertive in setting boundaries, more willing to push back against invasive or disrespectful lines of questioning. A subtle shift occurred, a rebalancing of power, where guests felt more empowered to protect their integrity and less obliged to endure humiliation for the sake of good television. There were, of course, those who defended Fallon, arguing that a talk show host job is to be provocative, to ask uncomfortable questions, and that celebrities who enter the public arena should expect scrutiny. But these voices were largely drowned out by a broader consensus that a line had been crossed, that the pursuit of ratings or viral moments should not come at the expense of basic human decency and professional respect. The junior producer who had initially voiced concerns about the planned segment reportedly left the Tonight Show not long after the incident, disillusioned with the culture she had witnessed. Her story, though unconfirmed, circulated among industry insiders, adding another layer to the narrative of a show that had lost its moral compass. Years later, the confrontation would be remembered as a seminal moment in late-night television history. It served as a stark reminder that authenticity and integrity often resonate more powerfully with audiences than manufactured controversy. The guest had walked onto that stage to talk about heroes, and in an unexpected way, he had embodied the very principles of courage and resilience he so admired in the veterans he served. He hadn't sought a fight, but when confronted with an attack on his character and his cause, he had stood his ground with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any of Fallon's increasingly desperate pronouncements. The empty chair he left behind, the microphone placed so deliberately on the table, became symbols of a principled refusal to participate in a degrading spectacle. It was a powerful lesson in the true meaning of influence, not the power to tear down, but the strength to stand firm, to speak truth, and to walk away with one's dignity intact, leaving the architect of the ambush to survey the ruins of his own making. The echoes of that night, the applause for his departure, the subsequent public reckoning for the host, all underscored a simple, timeless truth. Respect is earned, not demanded, and integrity, once lost, is a very hard thing to reclaim. The long-term impact on both individuals was profound. The guest, already a respected figure, found his stature elevated further. He became an accidental icon for dignified resistance, a touchstone for conversations about media ethics and the importance of standing by one's principles. His charitable work continued to flourish, drawing strength from the very public affirmation of his character. He moved forward with his life and career, the incident a mere footnote in a long and distinguished journey, but a footnote that nonetheless highlighted his unwavering commitment to respect and truth. For Jimmy Fallon, the path was more arduous. While his show endured, it did so under a shadow. He worked to rebuild trust with his audience and with potential guests, a process that required a visible shift in his interviewing style and a more cautious approach to controversial topics. The brash confidence that had once defined his on-air persona was tempered by a new, more somber understanding of the potential consequences of his words and actions. He never fully escaped the specter of that night, the viral clips and critical articles serving as a constant reminder of his profound misjudgment. The industry itself took note. The Fallon Norris incident, as it was sometimes unofficially dubbed in media circles, using the guest's real name in private, of course, became a quiet byword for how not to conduct an interview, a case study in how quickly a host can lose control of their own show and damage their own brand by underestimating a guest's resolve or misreading the public's appetite for aggressive confrontation. It led to more careful vetting of questions, more explicit agreements with guests about topics that were off-limits, and a general, if subtle, retreat from the kind of ambush journalism that had briefly threatened to become a late-night staple. The junior producer, who had left the show, eventually found work on a different program, one known for its more thoughtful and respectful approach to interviews. She often shared her experience, anonymously, in online forums discussing media ethics, her story serving as a small but significant voice advocating for change from within. The ultimate lesson, perhaps, was not just about the clash of two personalities, but about the evolving relationship between celebrities, the media, and the public. In an age of instant information and viral outrage, authenticity and integrity had become increasingly valuable commodities. Audiences were demonstrating a growing desire for substance over sensation, for respect over ridicule. The guest's quiet walk-off, his refusal to be baited or broken, resonated far more deeply than any of Fallon's attempts at cleverness or provocation. It was a victory not of force, but of character. The true tough guy image that Fallon had tried to mock and deconstruct was ironically revealed not in physical prowess or exaggerated memes, but in the unwavering moral fortitude of a man who knew who he was, what he stood for, and when it was time to simply say, enough. The silence he left behind was indeed the loudest lesson, a testament to the enduring power of dignity in an often undignified world. And so, the story of that night became more than just an anecdote about a talk show interview gone wrong. It transformed into a modern parable about the true nature of strength, the cost of disrespect, and the quiet triumph of integrity. The enduring legacy of that televised clash was not merely in the temporary dip in ratings or the flurry of online commentary, but in the subtle yet significant recalibration it prompted within the broader media landscape. It became a reference point, a moment where the unspoken rules of engagement between interviewer and interviewee were starkly illuminated by their breach. For the guest, it was an unsought test of character, one he passed with a quiet resilience that only burnished his already considerable reputation. He continued his advocacy for veterans with renewed vigor, the public's awareness of his commitment having been inadvertently amplified. His appearances on other programs were marked by an even deeper level of respect from hosts who had witnessed or heard about the Fallon debacle. They knew they were dealing with a man of substance, someone who would not tolerate disrespect, not for himself, but for the causes he championed. He became, in a way, a standard-bearer for principled conduct in the public sphere. Jimmy Fallon, on the other hand, faced a more complex journey. The incident forced a period of introspection, or at least a strategic reassessment of his on-air persona. The Tonight Show gradually shifted its tone, leaning more into the playful, game-oriented segments that had been his original strength, and away from the more pointed, potentially controversial humor that had led to the disastrous confrontation. While he remained a fixture in late night, the event left an indelible mark, a permanent caution against the kind of hubris that can lead a successful entertainer to believe they are immune to the consequences of their own actions. The audience, too, played a crucial role in shaping the aftermath. Their clear siding with the guest, their vocal disapproval of Fallon's tactics, sent a powerful message to networks and advertisers. There were limits to what they would tolerate in the name of entertainment. Respect, it turned out, was not an outdated concept, but a vital component of audience engagement. The demand was for authenticity, for hosts who could be witty and entertaining without resorting to cruelty or disrespect. The writer's room at The Tonight Show, and likely at many other talk shows, undoubtedly reviewed their protocols. The allure of a viral moment was weighed more carefully against the potential for a career-ending moment. The balance between edgy comedy and professional integrity was re-examined. The guest's simple act of walking away, of refusing to participate further in a disrespectful exchange, had a ripple effect, empowering other public figures to demand better treatment and encouraging media outlets to consider the ethical implications of their content strategies. Ultimately, the story became less about a single explosive interview and more about the enduring values of dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for one's principles, even when under the brightest and most unforgiving of spotlights. The guest had come to talk about supporting heroes, And in the end, his own quiet heroism in the face of an unwarranted attack became the most powerful message of all, a testament to the fact that true strength is not measured in decibels or ratings, but in the unwavering consistency of one's character. The silence of his departure was a profound statement, a period at the end of a sentence that Fallon had started but could not honorably finish. And in that silence, a clear lesson resonated. Integrity will always have the last word.